The medieval peasant's diet was not grey slop and misery, and the proof has been sitting in the salmon the whole time. This video is about what the 80 to 95% of medieval Europe that wasn't nobility actually put on the table every single day. Not the banquet, not the gilded marzipan, not the roasted peacock dressed back in its own feathers and carried in on a golden platter. The real thing, the meal that happened every midday in a cottage, from Northumbria down to Napoli for roughly 1,000 years. And look, it runs almost entirely backwards on you. The foods that fill the shelves of expensive delicatessens right now, wild salmon, dark rye bread, foraged herbs, aged farmhouse cheese, those were the foods of the lowest social rung in medieval Europe. The wealthy were actively embarrassed by them. There is a 15th century Italian author we are going to meet shortly who had opinions about garlic that are so snobbish you would swear they were written last week for a lifestyle magazine. What a medieval peasant ate, and more importantly, what they were flat out forbidden from eating, tells you almost everything about how that society was organised, and more than a few things about how ours still is. If you are the kind of person who looks at a plate of food and immediately wants to know who grew it, who was banned from eating it, and what century the recipe comes from, this channel is built for exactly that. There is a lot more food history here, and subscribing means none of it slips past you. To understand the medieval peasant's plate, you first have to sit with the single most disorienting fact about their food. The one that tips everything you thought you knew upside down. And it involves a fish. Salmon was peasant food. That is where this story begins, and it is jarring enough to be worth pausing on. Near the great rivers of medieval England, the Thames, the Severn, the Tyne, salmon was so plentiful that catching it required no money, and in many places no special permission. It was abundant enough to be considered a humble, workaday thing to eat. Now, you may have heard the story about apprentices writing clauses into their contracts demanding to be served salmon no more than 3 times a week because they found it so boring. To be fair, historians have been hunting for one of those actual contracts for centuries, and nobody has produced one yet. Almost certainly folklore, but the underlying reality it is trying to describe, that near a salmon river this fish was food for people at the very bottom of the social ladder? That part holds up. Now flip that around and look at bread. The darker the loaf, poorer you were. White flour required the labour of sifting, milling and refining, labour that cost real money. Dark bread made from rye or barley was processed as little as possible, and it was what anyone without means ate by default. Today we pay a premium for exactly that. And then there is garlic. The ingredient that right now anchors restaurant cooking from Tokyo to Buenos Aires was so thoroughly associated with poverty and agricultural labour in medieval Europe that a 15th century Italian author named Giovanni Sabadino degli Arienti felt compelled to write that garlic was always a rustic food, even if it is sometimes artfully civilized by using it to fatten roasted geese. Artfully civilized. I mean, the man was describing garlic as something that required emergency cosmetic intervention before it could be in the same room as a respectable person. The status reversal we are living right now, where artisan rye bread costs 4 times the price of white sandwich bread, where wild salmon sits in the expensive part of the fish counter, where garlic is aspirational, is a system running in exactly the opposite direction from the one that organized food for most of recorded history. What counted as good food in medieval Europe was almost entirely a function of labour and scarcity, not flavour. And the flavour, as it turns out, was often excellent. Knowing what a medieval peasant could theoretically eat is one thing. Understanding what they actually had on an ordinary Tuesday in, say, 1320, that story begins, as almost everything in medieval Europe does, with bread. Bread was not simply a food in medieval Europe. It was the structural foundation of the entire diet, the caloric baseline that everything else was built around, and a social signal readable at a glance from across the room. At the very top of the hierarchy sat wastel, fine white bread made from sifted wheat flour, closer in texture to cake than anything we would call a loaf today, the kind of thing that showed up at wealthy tables. Below that came bread made from wheat mixed with rye, then pure rye, then barley and oat bread. And at the very bottom, in the years when harvests failed, sat something called horse bread, made from dried peas, beans, acorns, bran, whatever else could be ground and baked into a shape. It was technically edible. The historical record does not suggest anyone described it as more than that. To understand how significant even modest improvements in bread quality were, consider a document from 1394. A ploughman in Lincolnshire receiving 15 loaves a week as wages, with the contract specifying that 7 of those loaves had to be wheat. That detail was worth writing into an employment agreement. Wheat bread was a condition of work specific enough to negotiate over, which tells you, everything. There is also the matter of medieval grain yields, which kind of puts the whole bread economy in perspective. A good wheat harvest in the 13th century returned roughly 4 to 5 seeds for every one planted. Modern wheat varieties return 30 to 40. That gap explains almost everything. Why bread was scarce, why a single bad wet summer sent prices spiralling within months, and why people in good years were still only ever one harvest away from horse bread. One use of bread that has completely vanished from modern eating is the trencher, a thick slab of 3-day-old, dense bread, slightly hollowed in the centre, that served as a plate at meals in wealthier households. It absorbed the sauce and gravy of whatever was placed on it. At the end of a feast, the soaked trencher was passed down to poorer diners or to people waiting at the gate. For those who received it, a gravy-drenched slab of old bread was not a consolation. It was probably the best thing served that day. Bread covered the carbohydrates. What a peasant drank. Alongside it carries one of the most persistent myths in medieval history, one that keeps getting corrected and keeps stubbornly coming back. The claim is that medieval people never drank water because it was universally dangerous, and that everyone from children to elderly monks drank ale all day instead. This is not quite right. The fuller picture: if you had access to a clean source, a mountain spring, a reliable well, collected rainwater, you drank water. What you avoided was water from rivers and urban channels that also received human and animal waste, which was a perfectly rational call given the complete absence of any treatment infrastructure. Where clean water was uncertain, you drank something called small ale, a low-alcohol brew whose purpose was hydration and calories, not intoxication. Adults in 13th century Northern Europe were consuming approximately 1 gallon of small ale per day, which sounds extraordinary until you remember these were people performing heavy physical labour from dawn to dusk in all weathers, and small ale was delivering both fluids and fermentable carbohydrates in one vessel. Children drank it too, from around the age of 5. Further south, wine played the same role, but the wine that actually reached England, when it reached England at all, was frequently not worth the trip. Around 1177, a courtier named Peter of Blois visited the English court of King Henry II and left behind a description of the wine being served there that reads like a catastrophically bad 1-star review. He wrote that it was thick, greasy, stale, flat, and smacking of pitch, and that lords were sometimes given wine so murky that a man had to close his eyes, clench his teeth, and filter the stuff as he drank rather than simply swallowing it. The local ale, brewed at home from barley and herbs, was, by almost any measure, the more reliable option. Bread and ale covered the basics. What a peasant needed alongside them was protein, and this is where a whole web of law, geography, and social control made what should have been a very simple question considerably more complicated. After the Norman conquest in 1066, the forests of England became royal property. All of the good hunting land, the silvadeges, the king's wood, was reserved exclusively for the crown and those it chose to favour. Deer, wild boar, pheasant, categorically off the table for anyone without a title, under punishments that could include castration, blinding, the loss of a hand, or death. There are accounts of poachers in parts of what is now Germany being sewn into the skin of the animal they had killed and set upon by dogs. Some of these stories may be legend. The punishments that are documented are severe enough that the distinction barely matters. So the poor got their meat wherever the king's lawyers couldn't reach. Pigs led the way. They reproduced quickly, ate almost anything, required minimal dedicated care, and cleaned the streets of medieval towns as a sort of free bonus. In London, a specific group of pigs called St. Anthony's pigs, belonging to St. Anthony's Hospital, roamed the city streets wearing bells around their necks. These were not healthy, well-fed animals. They were the scrawny runts and the malnourished animals that the Smithfield market supervisor had deemed unfit for normal slaughter. The ones nobody else wanted. A proctor from the hospital would collar each one with a bell and release it onto the streets to scavenge, and feeding one was considered an act of charity. Londoners fed them. The pigs grew fat on the city's generosity, and when they were fat enough, the hospital brought them back, slaughtered them, and used the meat to feed the sick poor in their care. The whole system, unwanted pig, London street, charitable passerby, hospital table, is, I think, one of the more elegant pieces of social infrastructure the medieval city ever produced. Within the peasant household, the pig was also medieval Europe's closest thing to zero-waste cooking. Blood became black pudding. Intestines became sausage casing. Fat was rendered for cooking. Trotters became jelly. Bacon and ham were salted and smoked over winter using the hook above the fireplace that nearly every cottage maintained, the rising smoke from the hearth doing the work of preservation for free, using heat that was already there. Nothing was wasted. Fish filled the remaining protein gap. Salmon and trout came from rivers. Herring, mackerel, eels and crab came from coastal communities. Eggs and dairy, from a cow or goat a family might share with neighbours, provided daily protein outside the fasting calendar, which we are absolutely going to get to. Fresh milk was rarely drunk as a beverage because there was no reliable way to stop it souring quickly. Instead, it became butter, or what was called green cheese, an unaged, fresh-made cheese that no wealthy person would be seen near, precisely because the poor depended on it. Beyond bread, ale, pig and fish, the medieval peasant had access to a source of flavour that cost almost nothing, required almost no space, and rivalled anything a spice merchant could sell. The kitchen garden, right outside the cottage door. The word potager comes directly from the French for pot, the vessel that most of what grew in a cottage garden eventually ended up in. These gardens were dense with what we now treat as specialty ingredients: sorrel, sage, mint, rosemary, thyme, leeks, onions, carrots, parsnips, cabbages, peas, beans. The herbs were not decorative. They were doing the work that expensive imported spices did in wealthy kitchens. A noble household might finish a dish with saffron from the Iberian Peninsula, or black pepper from the East Indies, spices that at certain points cost their weight in silver, traded along routes that took months to complete. A peasant household finished the same structural dish with sorrel or sage from 6 feet away. The flavour was different. The instinct was identical. Plain food needs something to animate it, and garlic grew in these gardens too, despite Degliariente's architectural objections. Medieval nutritional thinking operated through the theory of the 4 humours, the idea that ingredients were hot, cold, wet or dry, and that eating well meant correcting imbalances in the body. Garlic was classified as hot and dry, which made it medically appropriate for people doing heavy, cold weather labour. It was, effectively prescribed, which makes Degliariente's contempt for it so much funnier in retrospect. The man was sneering at medicine. Now the potager was yours to tend freely. The moment you wanted something from someone else's land, though, their orchard, their park, their private woodland, you were in entirely different territory. Wild cherries, strawberries and blackberries could be foraged from common woodland freely enough. Apples and pears might grow in the garden, but certain fruits were actively guarded, and the penalties for wanting the wrong thing could be severe. In Le Puritain, the same story collection where our garlic critic makes his appearance, there is a story about a peasant caught eating a peach intended for the local knight. He blamed the theft on a donkey. The knight was unconvinced and beat him, the text says, mercilessly. Punishing peasants for poaching prized provisions was, in Disorienting's world, a perfectly normal pastime for the posh. In Norman England and across much of Europe, it was also, frequently, the law. The potager, the pig, and the river gave the peasant a working diet. But there was a third institution with very firm opinions about when you were allowed to eat and exactly what you were allowed to eat. And it had more leverage over the medieval plate than any lord or landlord. By the 10th century, the Catholic Church had formalized mandatory fasting 3 days per week, Wednesdays, Fridays and Saturdays, during which no eating was permitted before 3 in the afternoon. In the later medieval period, this got pushed back to after evening prayers. Even later. Then came Lent. 40 days from Ash Wednesday to Easter Saturday with no meat permitted, and in the stricter interpretation consistently applied through much of the period, no dairy and no eggs either. By the later medieval period, Lent had expanded to 46 days because 6 Sundays were folded into the count. For a peasant doing heavy physical work through March and April, 6 weeks of salted fish and bread with 1 meal per day instead of the usual 2 or 3 was a measurable physical hardship, not a spiritual experience, a hardship. The Church's rules also generated one of the stranger passages in the history of food classification, because aquatic creatures and things associated with water were held acceptable on fast days. Ecclesiastical authorities in various regions made rulings about borderline cases. Beaver, whose flat, scaly tail was taken as evidence of fish-like nature, was officially classified as fish in some jurisdictions. Puffins, which spent most of their lives at sea, were ruled acceptable in coastal communities. Barnacle geese, believed in some areas to hatch from barnacles rather than eggs, made the list in certain regions. These were not informal workarounds quietly used by a few hungry monks. They were formal ecclesiastical determinations, applied consistently. And they tell you a great deal about how completely food and theology had become intertwined in medieval life. The Church did not merely bless what you ate, it drafted the menu. All of this describes a diet that was constrained but functional, adequate in good years, and sometimes even good in its own right. The 14th century, though, was not a good stretch of years, not even close. Around 1300, Europe's climate began shifting into what geologists now call the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped. Rainfall increased. The warm period that had allowed English vineyards to produce wine and had sustained a near doubling of the English population between 1100 and 1300, from roughly 2 million to 5 million people, began to reverse. The 3-field rotation system that medieval farmers used to maintain soil fertility, already pushed to its limits by population growth, started to crack under the increased cold and rain. From 1315 to 1317, a sequence of catastrophic wet summers and widespread livestock disease across northern Europe triggered what historians call the Great Famine. In some areas, food production fell by 80%. Grain prices rose by 100 to 300% within 2 years. In the Bristol City Chronicles from 1315, the entry reads, "A great famine of dearth with such mortality that the living could scarce suffice to bury the dead. Horseflesh and dog's flesh was accounted good meat, and some eat their own children." That is a primary document. That is someone writing that down in real time. Estimated mortality in the worst affected areas reached between 10 and 20% of the population. And then, before full recovery was even possible, the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347. Within a decade, 30 to 50% of the population was dead. Some villages recorded total mortality. No survivors, no records, only absence. This is the context in which horse bread moved from emergency measure to daily reality for large numbers of people. But here is the strange and historically significant footnote to all of this devastation. The Black Death, by reducing the population so catastrophically, briefly and measurably improved food security for those who survived it. With fewer mouths in the same farmland, grain became more accessible. Wheat, previously available to working people mainly through wages or employment contracts, spread to people who had never regularly eaten it before. The ploughman in Lincolnshire in 1394 receiving 15 loaves a week with 7 guaranteed in wheat, was working in the direct aftermath of that grim arithmetic. His contract was, in a very direct sense, a document written in the leverage that 3 decades of plague had handed him. What stays with you after spending time in the food of medieval peasants is not how foreign it all feels. It is how recognizable the logic underneath it is. The zero-waste pig with nothing discarded, not even the smoke. The garden herbs doing the work of seasoning, that the wealthy were buying from a spice merchant at the price of silver. The small ale that was not about drinking. It was about calories and hydration in a body that burned a tremendous amount of both. And the great reversal, still running through our own food culture right now, where salmon and dark bread and garlic have flipped their meanings entirely, while the underlying machinery, scarcity, labour, and who gets to decide what counts as good food has barely shifted at all. Here is what I want to know from you. If you could sit down to the ordinary midday meal of an English peasant in, say, 1350, not the famine version, the decent, ordinary harvest year version, which part of that table do you think would surprise you most? The quality of it, the simplicity of it, or something else entirely? Leave it in the comments. More food history is coming, and next time someone tells you medieval peasants ate nothing but slop and gruel, send them the salmon.